Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Andre M. Perry, who's a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute and a scholar in residence at American University. He is also the author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, which is published by the Brookings Institution Press. How are you doing today, Andre?
Mark, I'm doing well, and it's an honor to be on your platform. I'm a big fan, so thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you on. So, beyond the intellectual aspects of this book, this is a very personal book. This is a personal narrative. When you're talking about the value of Black life and the value of Black homes, you're really starting with yourself in your home. So talk a little bit about, that personal narrative that's connected to this story.
When I got to Brookings, one of the first events I attended or participated in was one on looking at racial disparities in various sectors. And it was interesting that my colleagues on the panel talked about these issues as if they were completely separate and apart, sort of dispassionate external observers that had nothing to do with the outcomes that we were displaying. And it's clear that when you look at it from a perspective, even from a Black researcher, when I'm talking about housing, I'm talking about me. I'm talking about the issues my community go through. And so for me, there is no research project that isn't personal, and that too often people don't show their biases. I mean, they tell us when we are doing our dissertations to put your biases up front, but most often white privilege and other things are not put up front. We don't see those things. And in fact, for much of my life, I was told not to pursue Black issues because I somehow could not write fairly about those things. Mm-hmm. But again, I don't think our white colleagues have any more insight or capacity to write about housing than me. And so this is very personal. And so I wanted to write a book that honored the personal nature of the work, but also do it in a way that people can see or put a face to these issues.
We're in this moment now where everyone is looking for data, big data, and all these type of things in terms of talking about outcomes and trying to address various outcomes. And you make an important point very early in the book. Obviously we need to diversify research, right? But we also need to diversify researchers, right? If we continue to look for ideas coming from the same sectors over and over again, we're going to get some of the same outcomes. And so talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing and the challenge that there's been trying to bring your perspective, a Black perspective, on research that so many people would like to say we should be much more objective about.
Yeah, that whole notion of objectivity is so tainted with sort of white supremacist beliefs. Mm-hmm. That we just assume that white people are some kind of these neutral arbiters, and it's clear that who's doing the research ultimately impacts how it's framed and how it's analyzed, and too often, because there's so few Black researchers in particular sectors. I write a lot about economics, but I'm not an economist. And I bring a whole new lens to the world. I mean, if I can say, the success of my book is not so much it's new information, but I apply a lens to economics that just often isn't done. That people don't bring their Blackness in the field of econ. And so for me, with the exception of, you certainly have Sandy Darity, you have Derek Hamilton, you have some notable figures, Lisa Cook, all throughout the country, but by and large, we don't see our true selves or full selves in our fields oftentimes. So for me, I really wanted to represent, and I mean that. I really wanted to bring in new frame, because when you don't have a diversity, it's much more likely you're going to have blind spots in your research.
Yeah.
I opened up with a section on talking about Patrick Moynihan and the Moynihan Report, which is still like considered one of the top reports that have guided policy. And it's clear to me that Moynihan didn't have Black women on his committee, or he would have known that Black women and their family practices, their manners, wasn't the reason for poverty. I mean, but we went decades blaming Black women. But clearly he just didn't have a Black woman by his side at any point in the research, because they would have told him, no, baby, I'm actually saving lives, not eroding the quality of lives. So that's why we need representation.
And that's an important point, because, part of what you talk about is that whether we're looking at researchers or pundits from the left or the right, there is this desire to fix Black people. And you make the point, Black folks don't need to be fixed. Policy needs to be fixed, right? That's a totally different kind of conversation.
There's a running line throughout the book. It says, there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. Because whenever I talk about cities and wealth, reflexively, somebody in the audience goes, well, what about us? Or what about education and crime? And individual failings, so to speak, are the reasons why Black communities in many cases look the way they do, and completely sidestep the policies that literally extracted wealth and preventing people from getting investment, ignoring redlining, ignoring housing discrimination, ignoring appraisal behavior, ignoring real estate agent behavior. I mean, lending practices. I mean, if there's one area that we know just in housing that is just rife with discrimination, but we continue to blame Black people. And so I wanted to write a book that said, hey, enough. Let's show the data that assets in Black neighborhoods, one, are not as bad as we pretend them to be, but also let's look at the policies that made them so. But I also go into some solutions in the book as well. So, but we've got to stop blaming Black folk. And I know we'll talk briefly about the election because it's so important. But even in the aftermath of the election, you have some people who are saying that if we didn't say Black Lives Matter or defund the police, we may have actually gotten more votes. And at some point you go, no, that is just not correct. I mean, it's not like not saying it made Republican districts worse. No, I mean, I'm referencing Clyburn's comments around not saying defund the police. That just doesn't make any sense.
Nobody is going to defund the police. We can restructure the police forces, reimagine policing.
The only time it makes sense is we're constantly trying to coddle white grievance. We're always trying to say, hey, it's okay, you'll be okay, instead of saying, no, that's racist. And we can't build policy around racist behaviors and racist people. We should not.
Right.
And at some point, we got to stop centering that whiteness and start really creating policy that is designed to help all Americans.
You begin the book with a fascinating study of the city of Pittsburgh, right? And Pittsburgh is the kind of city that we might have thought about, defined 30 years ago as like the quintessential post-industrial city, right? What happens when industry leaves, right? And you're left with, in our mind, right, these predominant working class, working poor white communities, right? And you talk about, big tech coming to Pittsburgh over the last 10 or 15 years, with really incredible outcomes, right? And on some level, it makes sense. Pittsburgh has a great symphony, right? Pittsburgh is a great city, right? So the fact that, we have a San Francisco East, if you will, in Pittsburgh makes a lot of sense. And the average person would think, well, with all this big tech, with this influx of money and structure in the city, it's obviously going to impact Black communities very well. But you showed through your data that, in fact, the median income for Blacks went down 20% in the period of time that we had this investment, at the same time that the median income for whites went up 10%. I mean, how do you explain things like this?
Well, there's a lot of words in economic and community development that I try to expose for what they are in the book. So there's this term called placemaking, and it's essentially a term used in urban planning that says that we're going to improve the neighborhood amenities in ways that should help the community overall. So you might create new recreational activities, new parks, new services around particular developments. And that's what happened in Pittsburgh. An abandoned Nabisco cookie factory was used to as a place for Google, for Google's headquarters, and they built a place around it. But what I say in the book, when you're making place and the people of the community aren't in the room to discuss how to make it, you're going to get what you get. The developers, the architects, the city leaders who quote unquote clustered their resources in a particular area. If inclusion's not in the front, it's not going to come out in the back. And that's what we're seeing in places all across the country. We made places for white people at the end of the day, places for the tech industry, and we know that the industry is pale and male.
Right.
And so that's what we made place for. And so we got to make sure that when we are designing or improving a place, that we consider the people who are actually there.
One of the strategies that Black developers have used in this moment, of course, is to buy back the block. Yeah. And you talk about an example of a Black developer in Birmingham, and yet other examples of this. I mean, how successful have some of these efforts been, for Black investors to go in and buy up chunks of space in Black communities that have been underused or non-used, right, over, a periods of time?
Well, there's, again, as you mentioned, there's always been efforts for Black people to buy back the block. This is nothing new. I mean, certainly right now, I think the work of Nipsey Hussle, people really point to Nipsey as a leader, sort of this generation's, the person that led that charge. But we've always had people buying back the block, and it's actually you're very able to do that because in many areas, property devaluation is so low, the price of properties are so low because they've been devalued. Someone can use family and friends dollars to buy back the property. But what's happening is Black people aren't getting the money to develop it. So you see all these different folks who are actually buying the block, but not getting the resources to develop it. And then eventually somebody else buys it from them, and then they get the resources to develop it. But I offer in the book that we have to buy back the block for a number of reasons. Now, a lot of people will say, and they are correct, how do you buy back the block or what does it matter in an age of Amazon? And I remind people that there are still lots of community-facing neighborhood services that almost have to be proximate to the neighborhoods. So this idea that all retail is going to go away is ridiculous, and we need to figure out ways to develop commercial corridors. With that said, we also need to figure out ways to incubate high growth firms in those areas. And so, yes, not only does a brother deserve a coffee shop, a brother deserves a place to build the next great tech company as well in those areas. And so there are places in every city. You mentioned Birmingham, the work going on in Birmingham. There are individuals all over the country buying back the block, but few are getting the kind of capital to really develop it in a way that I feel that I borrow a lot from Afrofuturists in a sense of I want to be able to see a Black community not as a foil to racism or to a white community. I want us to develop spaces that are reclaiming new narratives or claiming new narratives, building new structures. And we need a new generation of planners to help with that. And there are people who consider themselves Black urbanists who are doing that work, who are really finding new creative ways to uplift the community. And so that has to be done. And I'm working with people all across the country. So hopefully that we'll see more investment moving forward. So those commercial corridors can really help uplift the neighboring communities.
You know, there hasn't been an elected official in the last 50 years, regardless of political persuasion, that is at some point haven't suggested that the importance of Black home ownership. What you talk about in the book, the Black home ownership, is a mixed bag. And the numbers, again, right, the things that stand out, that the value of Black home ownership is $156 billion less in comparison to white communities that are constructed the same way. I mean, that's mind-boggling. I mean, any of us who have bought homes, in the last 20 years, and looking to buy homes, we know what the prices look like in one neighborhood and look in another neighborhood, even though the square footage might be the same. So I think, implicitly we understand all of this, but when you put all these numbers together and think about home ownership as part of collective wealth, it's absolutely staggering.
When we did the study that anchored the book, we looked at home prices where the share of the Black population is less than 1% and compared them to places where the share of the population is greater than 50%. And on average, homes in Black neighborhoods, without controlling for anything, are about half as much than their white counterparts. Mm-hmm. But people always say that's because of crime, that's because of education, but those are things we can control for. And when we did, we found that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's $156 billion in lost equity. But what people don't understand is the gravity of that number. So I always put it in perspective. I tell people that $156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based on the average amount Blacks use to start up their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year college degrees based on an average 4-year public education. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. $156 billion would have covered all of Hurricane Katrina damage and is more than double the amount of the burden of the opioid crisis. It's a big number. But I also tell people, this is where my story comes in. I looked at where my father lived growing up. Now, he lived in severe places with severe housing devaluation. And as a consequence, he went to inferior schools. He had less opportunity to start a business because most people use the equity in their home to start a business. He had less access to quality infrastructure. Eventually, he got addicted to heroin. He was in and out of prison. He was murdered in Jackson Penitentiary right outside of Detroit. And he died a day before his 28th birthday. And I say all the time, yes, he may have died at the hands of another inmate, but you can't tell me housing discrimination is not an accomplice. It robbed him of opportunity. It robbed my family of opportunities. And I had somebody on a call once, well, look at you, you made it. And I was like, how many Black people in the communities that my father grew up in did not make it, not because of their own doing. They worked hard, they did everything, and they still could not get the value that they deserved on their investments. Yeah. So for me, this is, again, I'm glad you started off by asking me about the personal nature of the work. This research is personal for me. This is about the story of my father, my grandmother, the woman who raised me. This is about redeeming them from this horrible narrative that the conditions of Black cities and neighborhoods are a direct result of the people in them. And so for me, that's what I'm on a mission to do.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the woman who raised you in foster care, and you carefully describe her early in the book as an entrepreneur. And there's a way in which when we think about Black women, I was struck, the New York Times did a piece about this trend towards home daycares, that white folks are sending their kids to home daycares because of COVID. And there literally were 1,000 responses, my grandmother, my auntie, we've been doing this for decades. And it's interesting because we would never think to describe those women as entrepreneurs. Yeah. Right? When we talk about Black entrepreneurship, we're not thinking about Black women who run daycare and other type of facilities in Black communities. And I say all of that to say, towards the end of the book, where you make this claim about the need for us to elect a Black woman president, but how, the experiences of Black women are in fact political assets for those who are willing to invest in those insights.
Exactly. Black women are rising educational, social, professional ladders. But at the same time, they have the vantage point of very poor people, of people whose sons still get arrested, sons and daughters still get arrested, their sons and daughters still getting killed. And so they have a particular insight that allows them to relate to voters of all stripes. And part of the claim, the reason why I put a section in there on politics, because in order to break the cycle of devaluation that leads to all kind of racial disparities, you've got to put people in office to represent you. Yeah. Like, we're not going to nonprofit our way to to these problems, and we're also not going to create an app out of these problems. We also need policymakers who have our interests in mind. And so for me, when we're talking about investing in the assets in Black communities, the most important asset for us to invest in right now, and I don't like calling us that because we have a peculiar relationship to the word asset. We were once traded and sold and mortgaged and all those things. But our greatest resource right now is Black women. I mean, you look at their climb in politics, economic climb. We essentially have to reward that investment. And so I've been beating the drum. Let's not just give these get out the vote campaigns or apparatus the money. Let's start funding Black women to actually run for office.
Yeah. This is great. We've been joined today by Andre M. Perry, who is a fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. our scholar in residence at American University, and the author of the great new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, published by the Brookings Institution Press. Man, it's been great talking with you, Andre.
Hey, have me back, please.
Definitely. Take care of yourself.
All right, very good.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for watch.